I was driving down an old town road, the sun setting behind me and a sense of unease settling in my stomach. The tall trees along the road cast ominous shadows across the pavement, making me feel even more on edge. As I approached a bend in the road, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart skip a beat. In my rearview mirror, I saw a car following closely behind me, its headlights shining bright in the growing darkness. I tried to tell myself it was just another driver, but as I made another turn, the car continued to follow me, its headlights never faltering. I could feel my grip on the steering wheel tighten as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Suddenly, the car disappeared from my rearview mirror, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But as I turned my attention back to the road ahead, I saw the car again, this time much closer than before. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stepped on the gas pedal, hoping to outrun the mysterious car. But no matter how fast I went, it stayed right on my tail, its headlights blinding me in the darkness. As I approached another turn, I braced myself for impact, convinced that the car would crash into me at any moment. But as I made the turn, the car vanished once again, leaving me alone on the road. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I sat there in silence for a few moments, but as the night grew darker, I realized that I needed to keep driving. As I pulled back onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that the car was still out there, waiting for me just around the next turn. And as I drove deeper into the darkness, I realized that I may never escape the terror that haunted this old town road.
Once upon a time, in a small, old town surrounded by dense forests, there were only dirt roads. The locals had grown used to the dirt and dust that filled the air whenever a car drove through their town. But as time passed, strange things began to happen. Every time a car drove through the town, the dirt in the air seemed to thicken. The visibility would become so poor that accidents began to happen more and more frequently. People would drive off the road and into the trees, or collide with other vehicles they couldn't see until it was too late. Despite the increasing number of accidents, nobody could explain why the dirt in the air was getting worse. Some people said it was just the dry climate, while others believed it was some sort of curse on the town. One night, a traveler passing through the town decided to investigate. He parked his car by the side of the road and began to walk around the deserted streets. As he walked, he noticed something strange. There were no footprints in the dirt. Suddenly, he heard a whisper behind him. He turned around, but nobody was there. The whisper grew louder and more insistent, and soon the traveler realized that it was coming from the ground itself. He tried to run, but the dirt beneath his feet began to writhe and twist, trapping him in place. The whisper became a chorus of eerie voices, telling him that the town was cursed, and that anyone who passed through it would be trapped forever. The traveler never returned home, and the people of the town never saw him again. But to this day, people passing through the area say that they can hear strange whispers in the air, warning them to turn back before it's too late.
It was a hot summer day, and the sun was beating down on a deserted old town road. As the guy drove through the woods, he was enjoying the peacefulness of the surrounding nature. However, his peace was soon interrupted as he approached a spot where two cars were blocking the way. The two car owners were standing outside their cars, arguing. The guy was puzzled and wondered what was going on. As he got closer, he realized that both cars had been in an accident and the two car owners were arguing over who was at fault. He thought that it was unfortunate and decided to wait in his car until they finished arguing. As the argument continued, the tension between the two car owners escalated, and they started to fight. The guy realized that he had to intervene to break up the fight. He got out of his car and rushed towards them, trying to separate them from each other. However, as he was in the midst of the fight, he suddenly felt his car rolling backwards. He turned around, only to see his car driving away at high speed. He was shocked and didn't know what to do. He tried to chase his car, but it was too fast, and he soon lost sight of it. Feeling helpless, he turned around to face the two car owners. However, to his surprise, they had already gotten into their cars and were driving away. The guy realized that he had fallen into a trap set up by the two car owners. They had pretended to argue over the car accident, distracting him while the third person sneaked into his car and stole it. It was a well-planned and executed theft, and the guy had fallen for it. Feeling angry and frustrated, the guy realized that he had been taken advantage of. He decided to report the incident to the police and hoped that they could help him retrieve his stolen car. He also learned an important lesson: to always be aware of his surroundings and not to let his guard down, even in the most unexpected situations.
A group of 5 friends had planned the ultimate road trip, driving through the countryside and exploring the unknown. As they made their way through winding roads, they soon found themselves lost and disoriented. They couldn't seem to find their way back onto the main highway, and the roads became narrower and more treacherous. After driving for hours, they stumbled upon a small town that they had never heard of before. It was deserted and eerily quiet, with an ominous fog that seemed to surround it. The group of friends decided to stop and ask for directions, but as they got out of their car, they realized that something wasn't quite right. The buildings in the town were old and decrepit, with boarded-up windows and overgrown weeds. The only sound that could be heard was the creaking of old wood and the rustling of dead leaves. As they walked down the abandoned streets, they noticed that every door and window they came across was locked tight. Suddenly, they heard a distant whisper that seemed to be coming from the end of the street. It was barely audible at first, but it grew louder and more frantic with each passing moment. The friends tried to run, but they found themselves trapped in a maze of twisted alleys and dead-end streets. As they rounded a corner, they stumbled upon a group of locals who were dressed in outdated clothing and had a menacing look in their eyes. They beckoned the group closer, offering to help them find their way back to the highway. But the friends could sense that something wasn't right, and they turned to run. The locals chased them relentlessly, closing in on them with each passing moment. The friends were trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. They eventually found themselves back in the heart of the deserted town, with the locals closing in on them from all sides. The friends huddled together, trembling with fear as the locals closed in. Suddenly, the ground beneath them gave way, and they found themselves tumbling down into a deep, dark pit. The friends screamed in terror as they realized that they had been led into a trap, from which there seemed to be no escape. Days later, when the friends were reported missing, the authorities searched the surrounding area but found no trace of them. The town they stumbled upon was never found again, and the locals who had chased them were never identified. To this day, people still whisper about the small town where time seemed to stand still, and the group of friends who disappeared without a trace.
As I drove through the woods on an old town road, I suddenly felt uneasy. There was no one around, but I had a strange feeling that I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling persisted. Then, I noticed something strange. Behind the trees lining the road, I could see people standing, barely visible in the shadows. It was as if they were hiding, waiting for something or someone. I slowed down my car, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Were these people in trouble? Were they lost? But as I approached, they didn't move or respond to my calls. My unease turned into fear as I realized that these people were not there to help. They looked hostile, and their silence only made it worse. I didn't want to stop my car, and I didn't want to be trapped by whatever was going on. I made a quick U-turn and started driving back in the direction I had come from, hoping to escape whatever was happening. But as I passed by the people behind the trees, they suddenly stepped forward into the road, blocking my path. I was trapped, and I had no choice but to stop my car. My heart was pounding as the people approached my car, their expressions unreadable. I locked my doors and tried to stay calm, but it was hard. Then, they started pounding on my car, trying to break my windows. I knew I had to act fast, so I hit the gas and tried to drive through them. Luckily, they moved out of the way, and I managed to speed away from them. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the woods. It was only then that I allowed myself to breathe again. What had just happened? Who were those people? I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. That experience taught me to trust my instincts and to be aware of my surroundings. I still drive on old town roads, but I'm always vigilant, looking out for any signs of danger.
I was taking a long drive, trying to escape the rush hour traffic of the main road. I had been stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic for what seemed like hours, and my patience was wearing thin. I turned onto an old town road, hoping to find a shortcut, but to my dismay, there were still plenty of cars on the road. As I continued to drive, I noticed that the traffic was getting worse. The cars were moving slower and slower, and there seemed to be no end in sight. Frustrated, I checked my phone for alternative routes, but there were no other options. That's when I saw something that sent a shiver down my spine. The car in front of me and the car behind me had no drivers inside. At first, I thought it was some sort of prank, but as I looked around, I realized that all of the cars on the road were unmanned. I was paralyzed with fear, wondering how this could be possible. Were these self-driving cars gone rogue? Or was something more sinister at play? My mind raced with possibilities, but I couldn't bring myself to leave my car and investigate. As I sat there, trapped in the traffic, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I checked my rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was just my imagination, but the empty cars around me made it impossible to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the traffic started to move again. The unmanned cars in front of and behind me continued down the road, and I followed them, too scared to take another route. When I finally emerged from the old town road, I took a deep breath and vowed never to take that shortcut again.
I was on a road trip with my friends when we decided to stop in an old town to take a break. We were all thirsty and hungry, so we stopped at a convenience store to get some drinks and sandwiches. As soon as I took a sip of the drink, I knew something was wrong. It tasted horrible, like it had been sitting on the shelf for years. I tried to ignore it and take another sip, but it only made me feel sick. I looked at my friends, hoping they were having a better experience, but their faces were twisted in disgust as well. We decided to grab some sandwiches and hit the road, hoping to leave the old town behind us. But as we drove away, I noticed something strange. The town was eerily quiet, as if there was no one around. The streets were empty, and the only sound we could hear was the sound of our car's engine. I started to feel uneasy, and the bad taste of the sandwich only made things worse. We all felt sick, and I knew we had to stop and take a break. We found a spot to park the car and got out, hoping some fresh air would make us feel better. As we walked around, we noticed that the town was in a state of disrepair. Buildings were abandoned, and there was no sign of life. It was as if the town had been frozen in time, untouched by the outside world. We decided to go back to the convenience store and ask for a refund. But when we got there, the store was empty, and the lights were off. It was as if it had been abandoned for years. We were about to leave when we heard a sound coming from the back of the store. It was a faint whisper, as if someone was trying to communicate with us. We followed the sound, and it led us to a door at the back of the store. We opened the door, and what we saw made our blood run cold. The room was filled with decaying food and drink, and there were rats crawling everywhere. The smell was unbearable, and we knew we had to get out of there as soon as possible. We ran back to our car and drove away from the town, never looking back. We never found out what had happened in that old town, but it was clear that something was not right. To this day, the bad taste of the drink and the sandwich still haunts me, a reminder of the horrors we encountered on that road trip.
I always dreaded driving home at midnight because it meant passing through an old town, and then through a small road that was surrounded by dense woods. The thought of being stranded in the middle of nowhere was always at the back of my mind, but I never thought it would actually happen. One night, on my way home, I heard a loud thump and felt my car lurch to the side. I knew immediately that I had a flat tire. I pulled over to the side of the road and got out to inspect the damage. It was a complete blowout, and I didn't have a spare tire with me. To make matters worse, there was no one around to help me, and my phone had no reception. I was completely stranded, alone, and vulnerable in the middle of the woods. I sat in my car, trying to come up with a plan when I saw the headlights of a police car approaching. I felt relieved, knowing that the police would be able to help me out of this situation. However, as the car pulled up next to me, I noticed something was off. The officer's face was obscured by the darkness, and they had an eerie silence about them. I rolled down my window and explained my situation, but the officer didn't say a word. They just looked at me with an unblinking stare. Suddenly, I noticed something else. The officer's uniform looked old and outdated, like something from a different era. I started to feel uneasy and tried to make an excuse to leave, but before I could do anything, the officer grabbed me and dragged me out of my car. They handcuffed me and threw me into the back of their patrol car. I was terrified, and my mind raced with possibilities of what was happening to me. Was this some sort of sick prank? Or was I being abducted by a deranged officer? As the car drove deeper into the woods, I knew that something horrible was waiting for me. The silence was deafening, and the darkness was suffocating. I didn't know what was going to happen to me, but I knew it wasn't going to be good.
As a new teacher, I was excited to start my job in a rural, old town. The school I was assigned to was old and dirty, but I was determined to make a difference in my students' lives. On the first day of school, I noticed something strange. The students and teachers were all quiet, and no one seemed to want to talk to me. I tried to brush it off and focused on my lesson plans, hoping to make a good impression. After a long day of work, I drove to a small cabin in the outskirts of the town. The cabin is where I will be staying while teaching in this town. The drive from the school to the cabin is not that far, but for some reasons, I feel the drive took longer than expected. I brushed it off, thinking I was just tired from my first day of teaching. But as the days went on, the drive back from school to my place took longer and longer. It was as if the town was stretching out and getting bigger. The roads seemed to twist and turn in ways they didn't before, and I felt as if I was driving in circles. I started to feel uneasy and decided to ask some of the other teachers if they had experienced the same thing. But they all seemed to avoid the topic, as if they didn't want to talk about it. One day, I decided to take a different route back from school, hoping it would make the drive shorter. But as I drove, I noticed something strange. The road seemed to be leading me back to the school, no matter how much I tried to turn in a different direction. I started to panic and drove faster, hoping to escape the strange town. But the more I drove, the more lost I became. The roads twisted and turned in impossible ways, and I couldn't find my way out. I finally stopped the car and got out, hoping to get my bearings. But what I saw made my blood run cold. The town was deserted, as if everyone had vanished into thin air. The streets were empty, and the only sound I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. I started to feel as if I was being watched and heard strange whispers coming from the shadows. I knew I had to get out of there as soon as possible. I got back in my car and drove as fast as I could, hoping to escape the town's grip. It took a while, but eventually, I found my way out of that old town and back to the city. I knew I would never go back to that old town.
I was driving through the famous old road town, the winding road illuminated only by the headlights of my car. The trees loomed overhead, casting eerie shadows on the pavement. I had heard stories about this place, stories of ghosts and spirits haunting the town, stories of accidents and strange occurrences on the road. But I brushed them off as mere superstitions, just myths and legends passed down from generation to generation. As I turned a corner, something caught my eye in the distance. It was lying on the road, blocking my path. At first, I thought it was a dead deer, its mangled body sprawled across the pavement. But as I approached, I realized it was something far more sinister. The thing on the road was a figure, human-like in shape but twisted and contorted in a way that made my skin crawl. Its limbs were bent at unnatural angles, and its head was turned all the way around, facing me with empty eye sockets. Its mouth was frozen in a grotesque grin, as if mocking my terror. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just inches away from the thing on the road. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back. I tried to back up, to turn around and flee from this nightmare, but the car wouldn't budge. It was as if the thing on the road had trapped me there, its malevolent presence weighing down on me. And then it moved. Its limbs twitched and spasmed, and its head snapped back into place. It stood up, towering over my car like a demonic giant. I screamed, my voice echoing through the empty night. I tried to find some weapon, anything to defend myself, but my hands were shaking too badly. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the thing vanished. It dissolved into thin air, leaving me alone on the empty road, my heart racing and my mind reeling. I knew then that the stories were true, that something dark and malevolent haunted this place. and I knew that I would never visit Old Road Town again.